The story unfolds in a tight swirl of domestic comedy and aching human vulnerability, where ordinary conversations tilt into confessions and loyalties are tested in the small rooms where families actually live. It begins at the butcher's counter and a kitchen table, then moves to a bar storeroom, a Poconos motel room, and finally back to the living room, where two estranged brothers try awkwardly, angrily to remember how to be family again. The first movement circles Edith's gentle heart, the loneliness of a widowed butcher who mistakes kindness for invitation, and Archie's blustery pride, which he wears like a shield even when he is not sure what he's fighting. From there, the focus snaps shut, with the sound of a storeroom door trapping Archie and his son-in-law Michael together until morning, forcing them past slogans into the fragile truth about fathers and the names children are taught to use. A parallel thread follows Gloria and Michael to the mountains, where a couple who once never turned off the lights now wonders whether the furnace itself has gone cold. And in the last stretch, the past knocks on the door wearing a mustache. Archie's brother returns after decades carrying an old railroad watch and a letter that refuses to be opened now, and the two men wrestle darkness into something like forgiveness. What ties the vignettes together is the noisy hum of a household songs, half remembered from the radio, the smell of coffee and standing rib roast, and the peculiar grammar of teasing that has to stand in for tenderness until tenderness finally blurts out its own name drawn from the provided transcript. The opening movement pivots on Edith's habit of meeting every person as if the world has not taught them enough kindness yet. At Clemmer's butcher shop, she chats about marked-down pork chops and afternoon specials, worried over the man behind the counter whose grief for his late wife is undigested as present in his speech as the prices on his window. The dialogue is loose and looping, full of Edith's sideways logic, the kind that skims from hospital meat to Andrew's sisters, tunes in two breaths. Yet beneath it sits the ache of a small business owner who is trying to keep his days full, enough that the nights do not come rushing in too soon. When Clemmer Al later visits the bunker home with a standing rib roast and a sheaf of old songs, the evening begins like a civic ritual of neighborliness coffee cookies, a piano bench shared for harmonies that belong to a war era, but it slides into confusion when the widower mistakes Edith's warmth for an invitation to be loved. His hopeful Liebchen falls like a note that a piano cannot actually play. And Edith, mortified but firm, has to hand his gift back and then, in a sweeter gesture, hand it to him again by letting him keep his dignity. When Archie comes home, he is all quips and territorial jokes about cleavers and waves from the sidewalk, but the show lets the moment breathe just long enough for his real feeling to show he trusts Edith. He knows she's a good woman. He is in his way grateful that her kindness spills over the neighborhood and returns home as flowers on the table. The second movement traps Archie with Michael in a storeroom after hours, a perfect crucible for everything they never finish saying. The comedy is mechanical. At first, lost keys, a painted shut window with bars of street, Bernard fantasy about brandy on the Pope's tab, but it quickly slips into a talk about differences and sameness about the names boys learn in schoolyards, and the theology Archie builds out of Noah's Ark to justify keeping the sames with the sames. Michael, exasperated, calls it what it is, prejudice, got dressed up as tradition, and the script keeps refusing easy exits. The talk circles through bath time etiquette with a toddler, the way kids taunt each other with nicknames and how a single insult from childhood can echo, then doubles back to fathers, the first guy to toss you a ball, the first guy to belt you, the first guy whose approval seems impossible and therefore necessary. Archie admits a memory as if he's prying open a stubborn drawer one night. He overheard his father choose which son might get college and which son would not, describing Archie's mind with a farmyard. Cruelty so vivid, he still knows its taste. Michael, who has spent whole seasons parrying Archie's barbs, sits still enough to say the one thing that matters your father was wrong about you. The laughter in the scene keeps surfacing the wrong door, the wrong blanket, the wrong words, but it never dissolves the seriousness. It only proves that love in this family is passed through jokes like contraband, and that apology sometimes has to wear the disguise of a wisecrack to make it through the front door. Meanwhile, Gloria and Michael run an experiment in rekindling by leaving the city for the mountains. They bring with them a comic strip's worth of props luggage, A silky nightgown, a chair that is always the wrong chair shoes that refuse to be romantic, but what they're really carrying is a question about marriage no room service can answer. How does passion survive the ways that comfort can sand a couple's edges down? The scene is an atlas of near misses, a study of how a planned kiss becomes a ping-pong autopsy, then a debate about the Knicks, then a debate about whether making a plan to be spontaneous cancels the spontaneity itself. The humor never stops the switching sides of the bed as if north and south could fix it. The near slapstick of a bathroom door barged at 2 instead of 3. But in the gaps, Gloria says it plainly. Maybe we don't feel the same way anymore. For a moment, the word divorce is the only furniture in the room. And then something odd and true happens. The very threat of losing what they were for a decade shakes them into noticing what has survived. Respect comfort, a friendship with deep roots, a child who changes the temperature of every decision, and the show lets desire arrive, not with soft music, but with the comic timing of a maid possibly entering at the wrong time. The point is not that a weekend fixes a marriage, it is that the willingness to talk through the silliness and the gravity without turning away can reset the current, even if only by a few degrees. Back in Queens, memory itself shows up unannounced when Archie's brother Alfred walks in after 29 years. The house suddenly feels like a museum, where all the captions were written by the wrong docent. Edith is joy. Gloria is curious. Michael finds a kindred spirit to tease. And Archie is a man whose body is braced for impact, even as his mouth refuses to say the word brother. Alfred has lived the kind of life. Archie distrusts multiple marriages union work on the left, a willingness to break conventions rather than break himself. And he arrives with objects that hum with past lives. Pop's old Hamilton pocket watch from the railroad, and a sealed letter he asks Archie to open in 3 weeks. Everything about the meeting is jagged. Archie snarls about lifestyles and funerals missed. He pulls out petty accounts from a childhood ledger, the cockroach derby, and who poured cola on which insect, and tries to turn small resentments into a thesis for permanent exile. Yet time keeps interrupting with its own arguments. The watch does not keep time well anymore, but its case still pops, and Archie can't help his face softening when he touches what his father once touched every day. When Alfred returns to the bar to try a second goodbye, the scene finally drops the cousins and card games and lets the men describe each in his dialect the strange math of being sons of the same hard man. Alfred confesses the truth about the funeral. He was drunk, not celebrating, but paralyzed by the pain of not wanting to say goodbye. Archie confesses the truth about his own youth. He did everything right, worked hard, believed his father's every word, and still felt like a bird with the wrong brain for flight. Between them hangs the sentence, neither wants, but both need Pop was wrong. The show does not make them hug. It gives them something more durable for men like this, a plan to meet again for lunch in 29 years from tomorrow, and the sweet cheat of moving that appointment up by a few weeks after the letter is read. In their world, reconciliation has to be disguised as a joke and scheduled like a service call. But the look they share says the ledger can finally be closed without either man winning. Threaded through all of this are the sonic and cultural loops that make the neighborhood feel like a working memory. Old songs flare up like matches in a draft. Don't sit under the apple tree. Glenn Miller's Parade, and the way everyone half remembers the lyrics becomes a metaphor for how families recall the facts close enough to sing together wrong, enough to fight about. Food is a currency of affection and a flimsy alibi for risk pork chops at impossible prices, standing rib roast passed like a bouquet coffee, brewed and rebrewed while confessions find their way to the surface. Work is omnipresent Archie's bar and its cash register that never balances to the penny. The butcher shop with its sirloin specials, the old brakeman's watch, and with it, the old creeds that work was supposed to make everything make sense. In the gaps between scenes, the characters use jokes as wire cutters to break through fences. They themselves erected Archie's prehistoric tropes about sames and difference, get tested not by a debate, but by the stubborn decency of the very people he claims to sort. Michael's earnestness gets tested by the ridiculousness of trying to plan romance with a stopwatch. Edith's kindness gets tested by the necessity of saying no without making no feel like a sentence. Even the smallest running gags, the cash drawer coming up 14 cents short, or the street, Bernard with the Pope's brandy do the heavy lifting of tone, reminding us that life's hardest talk often happens while something silly is happening in the foreground, because silliness gives us privacy from our own fear. The moral center that emerges is almost embarrassingly simple, which is why the show has to keep hiding it inside jokes. People are not theories. They're the sum of what they survived and what they couldn't quite say. Archie's prejudice keeps tripping over his affection, which is why he ends up comforting a crying friend and scoffing in the same breath at an entire city's worth of strangers in alleyways. Edith's naivete is actually a practiced art of hope. It lets her invite a grieving man to sing and also tell him when the moment turns that kindness does not mean availability. Gloria's fear that the spark has died is more about grief for a version of herself than it is about contempt for the man beside her. Once she names that grief, the room has more oxygen. Michael's politics falter in a motel chair because bodies don't care about manifestos, yet the same man can speak the truest politics in the storeroom. Your father was wrong. You were worthy the whole time. Alfred's late apology does not erase absence, but it reframes it as human error rather than betrayal. Even the pocket watch's flaw, losing a half hour a day, feels like an argument in favor of mercy. None of us keep perfect time. The miracle is that we keep showing up to wind the thing and listen for the click. By the end, the household's equilibrium is not restored so much as it is matured. The butcher has been told the truth without being humiliated. Edith has preserved both charity and boundaries. Archie has admitted that the name he called himself wasn't the one he deserved. Michael and Gloria have realized that heat can return not by pretending they are newlyweds, but by remembering that love can be sturdy without being constant fireworks. The brothers have exchanged objects and incomplete sentences that amount to a truce. The next day, there will be another bar shift, another grocery, run another small quarrel about a thermostat or a child's bedtime. But there will also be a lunch penciled onto a page, a letter waiting on a dresser for the proper week to arrive, and a watch that, though imprecise, now ticks in the pocket of the right man. That is how this household finds its meaning, not in the certainty of a slogan or the neatness of a finale, but in the way flawed people keep dragging their chairs back to the same table, pouring coffee again, and trying once more to speak in a language they are only just learning to understand. The next sweep of the story tightens its focus on the texture of talk, how people in this household use small jokes and half-remembered melodies to carry what they are not yet ready to say plainly, and it starts mischievously with a song. The family hums their way into the day on an old refrain about how those were the days, a nostalgic overture that does two jobs at once. It gives everyone a common rhythm to step into the morning, and it quietly advertises Archie's preferred map of the world, where categories were clear, men and women knew their lanes, and the factory of life supposedly ran on time. The theme is more than a tune, it's the grammar of Archie's comfort. He will spend the rest of these episodes having that grammar tested by living human paragraphs he didn't write. Edith's errands return us to the butcher's shop, where time itself feels a little bent. She visits on the same weekday as always, a ritual he notices because ritual is the raft he's clinging to since his wife died. The transcript lingers on his prices and specials as if the numbers could hold back chaos. But what you really hear is the ache underneath the calculation. He wants the counter to feel like a place where stories still make sense. Edith's story about how his wife died detours the way Edith's stories always do, comic and tender, full of racetrack metaphors and mistaken hazards. It's the delivery of a person for whom life's tragedy insists on being narrated in a way that lets others smile. When he shows up later with a standing rib roast and that quivering hope that coffee and old harmonies might be the bridge to companionship, the scene plays like a domestic waltz with an offbeat beat. For a moment, the piano is an altar. Then the moment slides, and the man's need asks too loud. Edith's boundary setting is the episode's quiet feat. She returns the misread gift, not as a rejection of him, but as a defense of the marriage that makes her kindness possible. In a house where laughter is the usual shield, her no is simple, honest, and kind enough that it still leaves him room to stand. Elsewhere, the bar becomes a trap and then a confessional. Archie and Michael end up locked in the storeroom, a sitcom predicament designed with a scalpel. The keys are gone, the window is barred, the air is thick with insults that have lost their venom through sheer repetition, and yet the situation forces what the open living room never could. The two men must sit with each other's company without an audience to rescue them. At first, the banter is a ping-pong of petty jabs, the way Archie can turn a rescue fantasy into papal brandy and a street. Bernard, the way Michael can turn any topic into a lecture on fairness and logic, but the room's locked door keeps subtracting exits until the only way out is through. The argument about sames with sames starts as one of Archie's familiar arrangements of the world, an arc where everything is neatly paired and nothing intermixes. Inside that metaphor sits an entire worldview marriage as classification neighborhoods, as boxes safety as sameness, and Michael, half amused and half furious, keeps pressing for the claim underneath the metaphor. The conversation swings unexpectedly to the way kids fling nicknames on playgrounds, to a toddler's bath time etiquette, to the accidental lessons boys absorb about what counts as tough. That is where Archie's bravado splits, and the first true thing falls out a remembered night when he overheard his father staking the family's future on one son's brain and the other son's labor. The insult is grotesque enough to be comic, comparing a boy's brain to a bird's. But hearing it as a boy hardened the man who would grow up to say it aloud, as if saying it could keep it from stinging. Michael's answer is the episode's counterweight. He tells Archie the sentence was a lie. And the two of them sit with the idea that a father can be wrong about the very thing a son has used to measure himself his whole life. You hear the lock in the door, and you hear another lock holder clicking open. The mountains become a pressure test for Gloria and Michael, who discover that planning romance and feeling it are cousins that do not always speak. In the Poconos, the props are perfect for farce luggage chairs that never fit the scene. You want a silky nightgown that feels like a theater costume, a counting game at the bathroom door that can't decide whether to be cute or ridiculous, but beneath the slapstick is a simple dread they might have built a beautiful life and still misplaced the weather that once blew through it. The weekend is their experiment in remembering, and the transcript lets the misfires accumulate until the word divorce briefly appears like a stranger in the doorway. It's not a threat so much as a mirror. By saying it out loud, they see themselves clearly enough to count what they still have. Friendship that laughed its way through lean years. Respect that does not evaporate when passion stalls. The furnace did not go out. It downgraded from a roar to a low working hum, and if they can smile at how ridiculous they've been, they can also admit that desire sometimes needs the risk of loss to reappear. The tension doesn't resolve with violins. It dissipates with the timing of physical comedy, a near entrance by a maid who almost and then not interrupts them at exactly the right moment. The show's choice here is merciful. It allows an ordinary marriage to be ordinary again without insisting on a moral larger than the one most couples' live attention is a practice. Love likes to be invited back. Then the past arrives wearing a familiar face and a fundamentally different creed. Archie's brother Alfred breaks a silence that is old enough to be a habit and enters a home where the very word brother has been replaced by an empty space. The first pass is a shock and a smile, others making introductions. Archie refuses to edit into acceptance. Alfred has lived on the other side of lines. Archie treats as fences, multiple marriages, union politics, a companionship with a woman not sanctified by Archie's rulebook. He brings two artifacts of their father, a railroad pocket watch and a letter to be opened, later objects that function as time bombs planted in the afternoon. If the watch proves that time is still a thing you can hold in your hand, the sealed letter proves that some truths are only survivable if you schedule them. Archie hides behind jokes sharp enough to draw blood and laments the funeral attendance that didn't happen as if it were the only important accusation left. The Roach Derby memory surfaces as the sort of childhood trial that becomes a myth. A long ago cola poured at exactly the wrong moment gets repurposed as Exhibit A in a case for permanent estrangement. Around them, Edith, Gloria, and Michael keep trying to turn this into the visit they wish it were coffee conversation. A tour of photographs on walls because hope is the family's default setting, even when the men in the center of the frame have forgotten how to use it. The second meeting away from the house and amidst the bar's noises permits the truth to step forward in plain shoes. The letter has not yet been opened, which is its own kind of answer. Archie does not need the language of a dead man to tell him what he already remembers, and Alfred does not need a legal reading to find a path back into a conversation with the living. The brothers talk about the funeral again, but this time Alfred's confession sands down Archie's grievance. He wasn't carousing. He was drunk because goodbye felt impossible. The apology does not rewrite history. It lets both men use a better pen on the rest of the page. Then Archie tells the story he keeps behind a joke, the one about overhearing his father choose who deserved school and who deserved the night shift. In that telling, he finally admits the part that scratches him rawest. He believed everything his father ever said, worked hard the way he was told to took the belts without crying, because that's how his father's love seemed to be measured, and still ended up the son considered less. Alfred's response is the correction that has been waiting decades to be spoken. He looked up to Archie, not because Archie was perfect, but because he was brave in the ways that mattered. Street tough, uncomplaining, stubborn enough to carry a family through days when paychecks and patience were both thin. Underneath the banter, this is the exchange that frees them. One brother returns the admiration that the other one thought was only ever directed in the opposite direction. The watch itself is a clever prop because it refuses to be perfect. It loses a half hour a day, which turns into a joke both men can actually share. Neither of them keeps perfect time anymore either, but also into a living metaphor for how memory runs. You can't trust an old mechanism to keep pace with the present. You can only wind it faithfully and accept that some hours will be short and some unusually long. The letter becomes less a verdict than a talisman, for patience hold it for 3 weeks, and maybe in those weeks the lines that need to soften will soften. What the family learns to do in the meantime is live as if reconciliation is possible without making that expectation a burden. They invite Alfred and Amy into rooms where the conversation can survive without tribunal logic. They refuse to turn a complicated love life into a charge sheet. They wait. The storeroom episode does not vanish while all of this plays out. Its lesson keeps echoing through later scenes like a voice from down a hallway. Once Archie has had his most dangerous assumption, contradicted that his worth was fixed by a father's cruel metaphor, he cannot quite swagger the same way. His jokes still crack like small fireworks in the living room, but the senders are different. A little more of the fuse burns in empathy. When a friend's heart surgery comes up as a barroom topic, Archie's comedy about invitations and ballets and bypasses still shows off his rhythm, but the beat lands differently, as if the words are testing whether it's safe to be afraid. He still picks his political fights with a reflex, still polishes categories as if the world might fall apart without him on duty at the border, but the longer he lives with the memory of his father's wrongness, the harder it becomes to believe in the old sorting hat as anything but a habit that saved him once and now mostly costs him. Gloria and Michael's return from the mountains is not marked by fireworks, but by a quiet increase in fluency. The transcript uses running gags, the wrong chair, the wrong count, the wrong shoes as a mirror they can laugh in together. Their domestic life resumes with the familiar cadence of work and childcare. Yet the Poconos experiment leaves behind a practical lesson. Desire is not a permanent setting. It is an appliance that prefers to be used cleaned and occasionally unplugged before being plugged back in. They do not speak in the language of therapy. They speak in the language this family knows, teasing half-sarcastic apologies, oddball comparisons to sports or pastries, but the new softness is detectable in the way their impatience misfires less and their inside jokes catch faster. Edith keeps the neighborhood's pulse steady. She does it by complimenting people with metaphors that would wilt in any other mouth, comparing a woman to a prime rib roast, because she's trying to find the nicest language she has, and by moving toward trouble with the naive courage of someone who has experienced enough life to know that naivete is a strategy, not an accident. Everything she does in these episodes is a practice in holding two truths at once. You can be kind to the sorrows that make a man overreach, and still tell him that the door he wants to open stays closed. You can honor the dead by remembering their best, and also refuse to let their worst rule your house. You can be delighted by a song even if you sing it badly, because delight, not accuracy, is what keeps the air in a home breathable. Her presence is the conducting wire that allows the other's energy to find a safe path to ground. When the 3-week mark approaches and the letter seal is meant to break, the narrative does something wiser than staging a dramatic reading. It suggests that the letter's power was in the waiting. In the interval, Archie and Alfred discover that the unsealed truths were the only ones that mattered. Each man needed to see the other, not as a map of choices, but as the sum of his endurance and his regrets. If the letter is eventually opened, it likely says nothing that their faces haven't already said over cards and coffee. The father loved both sons imperfectly. He measured worth with the wrong yardstick. There is nothing left to win now, except the chance to show up when you say you will. So they set their standing joke about lunch 29 years from tomorrow, and then cheat the joke by inching it closer, because real reconciliations look less like trumpets and more like two men choosing the same table on an ordinary TEF day. Even the smallest loose threads, Archie's register coming up short by a few coins, the recurring debates over who sits where, whether a maid might walk in at the wrong second work, like little tuning forks tapped throughout the episodes. They keep reminding us that the grand themes of fairness, love aging, and brotherhood do not descend from balconies. They arrive in domestic disguises and need to be handled while you're also pouring coffee, changing a light bulb, or telling a child why nicknames can hurt. The brilliance of this cluster of stories is their refusal to put distance between the comic and the serious. The jokes don't apologize for the sincerity they escort. The sincerity doesn't scold the jokes for getting there first. It's the same blend that lets a flawed watch become a better metaphor than a perfect one, a device that fails a little every day and yet is worth winding, carrying, and listening to because it belonged to a man who did his best and got some huge things wrong. When the family finally sits again in their default configuration, Archie in his chair, Edith orbiting with the plate, Gloria and Michael trading a look that says, "We're okay for now," you feel the balance reset not to perfection but truth. The butcher will hang another special in his window. Archie will return to the bar and hide his vulnerable parts in a wisecrack, and sometimes in plain compassion. Gloria and Michael will forget to plan the next romantic weekend and then realize on a Tuesday night at home that the current has warmed a little anyway. Alfred will become a number in Archie's address book again instead of a ghost in his autobiography. And somewhere in a drawer, a letter will either remain sealed or lie folded after having delivered its message, its real usefulness, not in the words printed on it, but in the patience it taught the people who waited for it. The household continues, which is exactly the point. The great moral victories here are measured not in speeches, but in coffee, poured without bitterness in doors that open again after too long in old songs hummed off key. Because singing together is more important than being right.